Welcome to Trip Talks. I'm Trip Johnson, husband, father, and CEO of Advita Health. I spend my days leading a healthcare company, raising kids, and doing all the normal things people do when they believe they exist. But after years of contemplative practice, I'm pretty sure there's no one behind the wheel. On this show, I talk with teachers, builders, and others who think deeply about how to live well. We cover contemplative practice, work, family, coffee, community, and whatever helps us flourish in the modern world. If eclectic conversations are your jam, hit subscribe and check out my writing on Substack at What a Trip. All right, Marcus, welcome back to the pod.
All right. It's always good to be back. This is fun. I always enjoy when we get to record our conversations.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I think sometimes our conversations are just better when we're not trying to record them, but we're going to try and find the magic in here today.
Yeah, exactly. Let's shoot for it.
Cool. That's really helpful. I mean, you can see that I was taking a sip of coffee and you decided to just not say anything. Typical bystander effect.
Yeah, exactly.
If I don't do something, it's just on me. I got it. Trust me. I've worked with you long enough to know you're not going to take responsibility for this kind of thing unless it's on a performance review. So, Anyway, let's try and really dive in now. Now that we've already ironed out some kinks, hopefully. That long pause, I wonder if we'll leave that in there or cut it.
We're going to cut that.
I don't know. I'm kind of digging it. All right. Well, I'm going to jump in then since apparently the cat has your tongue.
Yeah.
I read a piece recently on multidharma.net about these threads of awakening, and it made me really kind of reconsider my position on the benefits of therapy. But kind of backing up before that, it's like, why does anyone embark on any sort of self-improvement process, whether that's going to the gym, developing a spiritual or contemplative practice, or going to therapy? And I think ultimately it's because we feel like something is missing, that we want to have a better experience of life. And I would say from my background, I got really into yoga and meditation when I was in the Army. And it was wrapped up. I didn't know that there was a distinction between the self-improvement project and the self-realization project. Once I became aware of that distinction, I knew that I was most interested in whatever you would call deep insight, the wisdom traditions. I wanted enlightenment, I wanted nirvana, and I wanted it in this lifetime. And I became much more interested in the self-realization project than in the self-improvement project.
So quick, what was your what was your initial segue into that? What was the onus, or what were you looking for when you started that contemplative process initially?
Well, I mean, at the time, I had probably just been arrested for the 6th time on something, drinking related. One of my best friends did a pseudo intervention on me and just told me my life was a wreck and I'm not the person I, could be. And so I decided to, I reached out to my dad and said, look, I'm not any closer to being the person I want to be at age 26 than I was at age 16, so I want to make some changes. And he suggested, yoga and meditation, sent me Untethered Soul and an Alan Watts clip, and I was kind of just deep down the rabbit hole from there, but with no real kind of orientation or grounding or background in contemplative practices. So I was just kind of drinking from a fire hydrant. And, very fixated on the practices, on doing it the right way. And then I ended up building an entire identity then really more around the self-improvement project, but I thought it was the enlightenment project. And it wasn't until maybe gaining additional insight that I realized there is a real distinction between those two. And I think that's where, quite frankly, if you don't have enough of the self-improvement project or you haven't done enough self-work, that's where you end up with a lot of gurus acting badly in the name of being enlightened, because and those things make sense. And so you need a good grounding, in values or in a tradition sometimes to actually get the insight without being a totally destabilizing figure to others.
Yeah, yeah. The destabilizing piece. Speak more. What are you thinking of when you say that? Can you give that like a really practical example of that?
Yeah, well, let me define waking up real quick because I think in defining that, maybe I'll answer that question next.
Hmm.
So I wrote this last week that for most of us, identity is bound up in the narrative self, the ongoing story in the head. I am Trip. I am a husband, father, CEO, coffee enthusiast, yoga practitioner. An awakening happens when, for some period of time, that identification breaks. The sense of I am this story drops away and the identity lands somewhere else. So I think
Yeah.
in this, again, the default way that we're operating in the world, I think even after glimpses of this, is that we are this person and we are largely interacting
Hmm.
with the world through the language in our head. And I think
Yes.
when that can break, like where does it land? Okay, so like that's what can be destabilizing. Is we're saying waking up is no longer identifying with the narrative self. So
Hmm.
then what are you identifying with? And if you don't have maybe proper grounding in that, this idea of no self, that you don't actually exist, from a felt experience, can just be very, very disorienting and cause a lot of kind of psychological problems.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the idea that I've lived my entire life with this default idea of me, all of a sudden I lose that, then what am I? Right? Like if I'm not Marcus, right? Then what am I?
Right.
Yeah, and I and that
And then the paradox is obviously that you're still Marcus, but you're not
right.
Marcus, right? Like you're
Yeah.
you're still a human in this flesh, and you have to deal with consensus reality. But now you've seen behind the curtain, and so
Yes.
how do you orient and how do you structure your life from there? Yeah, all of a sudden, like psychosis makes a ton of sense.
You know something interesting with that. I was There's a period of time in my career where I worked inpatient like psych stabilization, and this lady used to come in and she would teach mindfulness and meditation classes. And I remember the head of the psych unit lost his mind about it one time. Was just furious that she was doing it, because you were dealing with people that have pretty profound mental illness, right? And so he pointed out how destabilizing something like that could be, to have someone that is already dealing with internal stimuli fixating or focusing on this sort of like turning attention inwards, right, in some sort of way towards like unmooring that in something or whatever. And so I do think there's something inherently destabilizing in that pursuit, right? Like at its very core, it's supposed to sort of destabilize.
Oh yeah, I mean, and I think in a lot of traditions they talk about like the idea that you have to die, right? Like the
Yeah,
old
yeah,
you has to die, the identity, the fixation has to die, and yet you're still there in the world. I mean, I know usually for silent retreats they screen out people with certain mental health diagnoses, and I know when I was on a Goenka Vipassana retreat, we had someone kind of have a
yeah,
breakdown and have to immediately leave. So these are considered, I think, in certain traditions, these are like the spiritual emergencies. Like it
yeah,
is somewhat predictable that even someone with, kind of quote normal mental health, this can lead to some sort of kind of weird break.
hmm,
Fairly rare, but it is a potential effect to these
yeah.
pursuits.
So one of the things you've talked about recently, and then we've kind of talked about, is this idea like softening on therapy a little bit. And I've always abided in this weird headspace of, man, I was a therapist for a long time. I don't really understand what therapy is, and I always thought there was like some great answer to what therapy is. And I've never really found one. And I think there's like some commonalities and things that it ultimately sort of lands on. But when I started my own contemplative practices and engaging in the, sort of a non-dual practice, one of the things that dawned on me or became really difficult is, well, then what's the purpose of therapy, right? Like if there is this thing that we can just sort of engage in a non-dual practice, then what is therapy? But I sort of softened on therapy recently. Like I think I took a hard turn away from it, but there's some thinking and pieces that have started to lead me back to it has some value. I just don't know what it is exactly. And I know
Well,
too
I
many
think,
people have benefited from it, right?
yeah. I mean, for me, the thing that recently just opened my eyes was the Paul Salguero book that I shared with you,
Mm-hmm.
and really he talked about these like four threads of awakening. You and I are very familiar with like the emptiness thread. That's kind of the no self
Yeah.
thread. I think it's kind of the inverse. I think it's the same as the oneness thread. I think those are
Mm.
just two sides of the same coin, but maybe the subjective experience can be different.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then there's the energy thread, which I'd actually like to talk more because I'm actually personally exploring that a lot more with my practices these days. But
Okay.
then the last one was the psyche thread. And really the idea, kind of on the psyche thread was that like there is this entire unconscious mind, if you will, and
Mm-hmm.
like what factors that we are not aware of or not conscious of, like basically
Mm-hmm.
what is shaping the voice in our head, what is giving us our preferences, giving us our fears, why do we have this relationship to the world that we do, and the psyche thread is all about exploring that. And
Right.
so that there are these forces that have shaped us. And so, one of the places people often explore kind of the psyche thread would be in some sort of therapeutic relationship where all of a sudden, they start to understand cause and effect in their life. And all of a sudden that could lead to some sort of breakthrough where they no longer identify with the voice in their head in the same way. I think like a lot of this, and I'm no expert on anything therapy, especially not, internal family systems, but I
Yeah.
think the
Yeah.
idea that you could like label certain thoughts as, oh, that's just my protector or that's my
Yeah.
whatever, and be like, oh, that's not me. That's this process that
Mm-hmm.
happens and I'm aware of, that there is some element of like that voice in my head is not me.
Right.
I think sometimes it stops short there, but so again, I think the reading this book coupled with the people I know who have had profound changes in the way that they function
Mm-hmm.
have led me to soften on therapy. And then I would say one last thing is like not everyone wants to wake up.
Bingo.
Waking up. The idea of waking up is you are asleep and you want to wake up. For most people, having a better life is just the idea of having a better dream. It's not waking up and experiencing something totally different. It's just having more of what you like in your day-to-day experience. And I do think in some ways therapy may be even better suited than contemplative practices if that's your goal. Because if you
Right.
go the contemplative practices route and you follow it to the extreme, you don't know what you're going to get. I mean, you
Yeah.
just don't know. And it may upend everything that was good in your life. And therapy is generally kind of more grounded in like what is practically going on, what problems
Yeah.
do you
Yeah.
have, and how do you want to function better.
I think with therapy, like one of the things that it can be a little difficult with it is there's no like uniform definition of what therapy is, right? Like it is just this thing that people do and we do, and it seems to have some sort of value, and people get into it because they're wanting to improve themselves in some sort of capacity to improve their experience. But if like I had to take a stab at it, I would say something like a semi-structured conversation that has the purpose of gaining some sort of insight that you can act upon, that you can do
Mm-hmm.
something with. And ultimately, the idea is to shift your internal experience so that you feel better, right? Like, can I change my thoughts? Can I change my feelings? And then can I change my behaviors in some sort of capacity if I have enough insight that I can do something with? And, I think for a lot of people, you're right. Like, one, I don't think most people aren't interested in enlightenment or awakening or even just like meditation, really, right? And I one of the paradoxes of this to me, right, is like having some sort of awakening moment in which you aren't experiencing the world through filters and constructs, but you're just experiencing it as is, can be this remarkably freeing sort of thing. And once you've accessed it or experienced it in some sort of capacity, you can drop into it at any point, right? Like you can just begin again, you can step into it, you can use whatever language you'd like to use, but you can suddenly have this total freedom of just experiencing what happens. And the irony of that is once you've experienced it, you can just experience it, right? Like you know how to get there. Where I find that the irony in that though is I don't know how anybody does that without engaging in like a 10 plus year pursuit, right? Like through reading, and I know there's like always controversy, like there's differing opinions on this, but practically speaking, I'm just not sure that someone does that without investing a lot of time and effort and pursuing that. And so because of that, I think therapy for some people is sufficient to what they're looking for and is by definition different than awakening enlightenment.
Yeah. And just to be clear, like the psyche thread was not, focused just on therapy, but just the idea that there are all of these. So like in exploring this kind of thread of awakening, it made me realize that, maybe there's, therapy does have an entry point, just like, focusing on your breath as an entry point to the, the emptiness thread. Therapy could be an entry point to the psyche thread of waking up. And it also, I think, just to go, hammer the point one more time, is like most people aren't interested in that, and that's okay. But I've seen enough people really benefit from therapy to say, like, there is something that can happen there that can have a fairly profound impact on how they live their life. And that's kind of obvious, but, I think the mechanisms by which it happens is where, you and I are probably still a little skeptical. I think there's also like, one of my lingering, kind of hesitancies about like being all in on therapy is, one of the lingering things is, diet, exercise, sleep, these biological factors that contribute to our subjective experience. And that's where I think therapy can be a chicken or the egg. Like if therapy helps you address things that allow you to get better sleep, or maybe you had a ton of anxiety about going to the gym because you didn't know what to do. And, in that therapeutic relationship, you develop some tools to address those, then all of a sudden you can address the biological components that maybe were holding you up. But, that's kind of the paradox of any sort of waking up too, is there's like a, chicken or the egg. Like, in Buddhism, they always say like, you're already enlightened, you just don't know it.
Right. Yeah.
So
here's my piece with that, or addendum to that too, right? Like every real tradition or classical tradition, just whatever you want to say, like every religion system, all this, everything ultimately points back to living some sort of examined life, right? Like the root of like how you're going to improve your existence is by engaging in some sort of examined life. And I think a life that you live without curiosity isn't a particularly meaningful or interesting life. And I think for some people, therapy is a known commodity and a known pathway into engaging into some sort of contemplative exercise and pursuit. And because of that, if nothing else, it's probably worth its weight just because of that. Because it can just be an entry point into a contemplative life. And I think there's real value in that. I think there's some harms and dangers associated with it. But in general, it's a pathway into a contemplative life. And I think that has tremendous value that I've sort of softened on.
Yeah, and then I guess where I'm one of the places I also get hung up is just the idea that we are, in general, I think, like in therapy, and again, these can be really profound shifts.
Yeah.
But oftentimes therapy is about reframing thoughts, or therapy is about, having a better way to deal in a certain situation meaning that, you have these old constructs that you are operating under,
Yeah.
and in that therapeutic relationship, you gain some new skills, which are ultimately new constructs that help
Hmm.
you navigate the world better. And so sometimes I struggle with, like, why not just get rid of all constructs? Uh,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
but, like, I do think there's some benefit to, at minimum, having more universal constructs, right? Like, even when we talk about, like, I feel like from just a pure kind of leadership and management in the normal world
Hmm.
sense, I think, like, how many situations is this mental model, how many situations is this heuristic going to be helpful for me? And the more generally applicable it is, kind of like the more often it should be in my toolkit. If,
Mm.
again, in this like hierarchy of needs, right? Like I joke, we've joked before that, at the bottom is that biological component of exercise, nutrition, sleep, and then, and that can explain a lot of the world to you.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
as you move up this pyramid, at the very top of the pyramid, you get into some sort of discussion of post-labor economics where what do we do when AI takes all the jobs? What is
Right.
a life like? Or you end up also at the top of the pyramid in like a gender studies kind of realm where that lens can be very useful for solving certain problems, but it's not going to generalize as well as the biological components of life to like tell you what's going on in general. So,
Yeah.
again, biology still a construct, gender studies a construct. If you are hell bent, like let's just say you've got what you would call Trump derangement syndrome, it might be very helpful to find, you find out, hey, Marcus is just fucking struggling with TDS. This motherfucker is just so angry, and he's just, all he can do is watch the news. And then
It's
he gets
not.
in
Well,
bed,
yeah.
and he just starts scrolling through TikTok. And, I could attack that from, well, Marcus just needs to get better sleep because he's not sleeping well. He's agitated throughout the day. Being agitated throughout the day is leading him to pick up his cell phone. And picking up his cell phone is then disrupting his sleep further. So, are we going to tackle the sleep piece, or are we going to tackle the Trump derangement syndrome? And I think those are just those. Either one could work, and ultimately, you just need the right construct. So, if you need a construct that says I keep my phone outside my room, and that's going to help me lead to better
Yeah.
sleep, which is going to decrease my TDS, great. But you could
Right.
go the opposite way.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the, you just sometimes you just need a practical strategy, right? Like I think we are still biological creatures and beings that are interfacing in the world. So for the vast majority of us, and myself included, I think sometimes we just have to like rely on these sort of heuristics or something to fall back on, or some sort of construct that we can sort of rely on. I think that the difference, though, is it can be really tricky to not take the construct for reality. And
Yes.
so I'm someone that loves the psychoanalysts, right? Like, and I have this like weird love hate thing with them. Like, I enjoy reading them. I come back to them. I enjoy so much of their writing and their work. And in particular, James Hollis. Like, I just think his stuff is great. But ultimately, I think sometimes where the stuff gets tricky is these constructs that we sort of unconscious or whatever constructs that we sort of try to anchor into, we end up mistaking them as the destination or as the reality versus no, this is simply a thought pattern that I'm putting language to so that I can use it in the world, right? And that's very different than this is the reality. This one is a tool, and you recognize it as such, and you're not attached to it as anything other than just a tool to be used. Uh, Versus this is describing the nature of reality or the nature of mind. And I think those are two very different things. When it's taken as a sort of tool, then it's, I think, really can be useful, freeing, helpful. when it's taken as the destination, I think it becomes a source of exquisite suffering because you anchor your identity to it. It becomes what you view yourself as. And man, there's this one particular friend or person that I'm thinking of that just sort of drives me up a wall. Like I have a difficult time being around her when she's when she's been in therapy recently. And it's like she's the worst when she's been at therapy. And the reason is like she goes to some sort of attachment-based therapist, and they spend a lot of time talking about these images or ideas or attachment styles that she has related to her mom. And so everything gets filtered through this sort of lens. And it's like, well, actually, I think the reason you totally spun up is you haven't slept, you've been smoking a lot of weed, and like you're anxious. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, we all get anxious, and you're probably making it a lot more difficult on yourself. I don't know that this relates to any sort of internal relationship you have to your mom or to the idea of it.
I think that's an interesting I think this is one of those things that's, whether it's therapy or whether it's contemplative practice, again, the map is never the territory, right? So, on the therapy side, I saw a post today that said, like, is that person trauma dumping or love bombing, or are they just overeager to connect, right?
Yeah.
Is that person bipolar, or are they just moody? Like we've started to use this pathological language to just describe normal experiences a lot, and I think that is especially pervasive in certain modalities like attachment-based therapy. Can just like, again, it's giving you this new tool that could be useful in specific circumstances, but when you go in your toolbox and the only thing you have is a hammer, every situation is a nail. And on the flip side, like the same thing can happen with the spiritual things. Like if you walk around saying I'm enlightened or I'm not having any thoughts, are you just reifying that you don't have any thoughts, or are you actually not having any thoughts? And so you can, and I have been guilty of this at different times where like I'm absorbing all of these concepts, and so I'm just becoming a better puppet, like I'm just parroting back things that I've said, not what I'm actually experiencing.
Yeah. And I too have had that, right? The paradox, somewhat of a paradox, right? Like I become anxious or I start to strive or suffer because I'm worried that I'm thinking, right? Like, am I, it would go something like this, like, oh man, I just achieved it. I'm living in a non-dual, abiding, thoughtless, constructless state right now. Oh, wait a second. I just used language to describe the state that I'm now experiencing. I failed. And then
it's hysterical. It's really, the other, this is, kind of off topic from the therapy, but the one that I've gotten somewhat interested in recently, again, I'm interested in some of these other tools that allow me to escape that exact thought pattern where you recognize the non-duality and then you get attached to it and you try and hold on to it, which immediately just puts you back in the state of suffering and seeking.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I'm chanting, like not necessarily out loud, but like, I never did like real transcendental meditation practices, but like these mantra practices. And so not necessarily chanting in like kind of the Hindu or Buddhist context of repeating a chant, but like, whether it's just internally, the voice just you're repeating. I actually did this today for one of the first times ever just to see what it was like. But I was like, okay, when I was doing my Ashtanga practice, I was just going with the Om Mane Padme Hum, Om Mane Padme Hum. For like every breath was just a cycle of that. And that's one way not to be doing the looping thoughts. I mean, you're just looping on something else. But it was interesting in the sense of like, oh, I can see why, I can see the value in some of this if you know the state if you know what it is that you're trying, the state that you're trying to be in, maybe that's more effective. That you can't think your way into the state.
Yes, yeah. You're having to sort of energetically arrive to that state in some sort of capacity, and that becomes the
Yeah.
thing that pulls you into it. Yeah, I I think the other piece with sort of that stuff, right? Like the this is backtracking a little bit, but I'm thinking in some of the like constructs and therapy that people can sort of anchor into, and oftentimes it turns into this sort of like, can we gaze inward, and it turns into this sort of nasal gazing to try to understand the origin or the source of our suffering in some sort of way. And I don't think you have to know the source of a fire to put it out, right? Like, and this goes back to what we were describing earlier. Is like, can we just abandon constructs? Like, can we just get to a place of insight and awareness or awakening where we abandon constructs, right?
But could you do that in therapy? Because like in order for us to do the therapy,
Yeah,
we have to use language to communicate. If we're doing talk therapy, right?
yeah,
So you have to use some constructs, and we have to use language to communicate, to mediate, like, and there's always some, again, like I'm telling you something and it's imprecise because I'm using language, and then you're hearing it as the therapist and it's getting filtered through your lens. But like I think that's like one of the ultimate limitations. But going back to something you kind of hit on earlier is like, good, useful constructs are kind of maybe the point of therapy in a lot of ways. I'm experiencing this situation.
yeah.
I've now been equipped with some tools or constructs that allow me to navigate this in a way that makes me feel better. And so, like, that's where I just see it as like the fundamental limitation, but that I can draw a distinction between the waking up versus the self-improvement piece.
Yeah. So you did ask an interesting question, like, can therapy do that? And I'm sure there's probably examples that I can't think of, or you can't think of. But one of the things that draws me to the idea and some of the promise with psychedelic research is that like psychedelic assisted psychotherapy in a lot of ways is introducing you into a constructless non-dual state, right? And my own sort of pathway into non-dualism, I think especially early on was I was pretty into the practice prior to, so right, like I wouldn't be a pure example of this, but I did find that my own early experiences with psychedelics after I'd started engaging in some contemplative and non-dualistic practice, it really did become a way of introducing me in a very visceral and very powerful way, the idea of not being burdened by constructs or lenses. And obviously, there's plenty of examples of where we always sort of return to baseline. But I do wonder if that's the biggest promise in psychedelic therapy. And we could talk neuroscience and all that sort of stuff about it. But if brass tacks is, it just gets you to a non-dual state, so that if you've been in that state and you know what that state feels like experientially, you can just re-enter that state. There's nothing stopping. It's just a mental state, right? And once you know the place, you can just sort of find your way back to it.
Yeah, I think that's like one of the, obviously, like I'm a huge, I think psychedelics should be almost a frontline defense for being human. Like I think like when, especially like, let's just say you're a fully formed adult in the US, you're 26 or 27, and now you have all the neuroses that you are expected to have in our society. It would be a great thing, and in a lot of ways to me, it was a coming of age, my prefrontal cortex has developed. Now you need to do a high dose of LSD. I don't think that's going to get traction anywhere, but like I'd be willing to bet that like we'd get a lot more. If you could just, if we could just give Congress ego death dose of LSD together, like they'd get a lot more shit done. Like, maybe not while they're, talking about the curtains, falling off the walls and, but like afterwards, I mean, there is something that, and I think the promise is that, like, yes, you're right. Like, those can just immediately put you in a state, whether you want to call it non-dual or where the self goes away, you lose the normal frame of reference, and all of a sudden there's just like a world of possibility.
Yeah.
And I think most of that possibility is like conditioned out of us. And the interesting thing to me, like the waking up process is that is a perfect parallel for being, what I would call asleep, is you realize the psychedelic experience is actually happening all the time. And it's just those brief moments where you step out of it, that all of a sudden the world's just happening without you in it. But like that is the natural state to some extent.
Right. Yeah. The world isn't contingent.
I feel like we went off a deep end there, but that's fun.
That's good. Yeah. The awakening thing, right? Like the enlightenment or awakening process, to me, I think can be really sort of difficult to sort of describe in some ways, right? Like I think it's tough for the idea of like constructions that we're sort of burdened by or we're living with. And I was just thinking that, like, as we were talking about that, it's like, well, what the hell is it? And I often go back to this, but the allegory of the cave, right? Like, I think it's just the most succinct, easy, especially for people like us that are sort of steeped in Western tradition. But essentially, it's Plato's allegory of the cave is this sort of metaphor for awakening, I think, and it's a really pretty perfect one in some ways, right? It's the whole story. Allegory is essentially you have 3 prisoners or so that are tied to these posts, and they're in this cave that's dimly lit, and they're looking and fixated on these shadows that are dancing about in front of them. And eventually, one of the prisoners is released for some reason, and he starts mucking about the cave, and he comes around, and he realizes that the shadows are being cast from these props that were behind him, and those props were illuminated by a fire. And as he's looking at the fire, he's like his eyes have to adjust, and eventually he crawls to the mouth of the cave and realizes that those props were representations of things in the outside world, right? So like he saw a tree, and then he realizes that he had seen the representation of a tree in the form of a prop. And so the way anytime I've talked about this with someone to try to make sense of it, I've always said it, like imagine you're going to a high school play or something, and people have created a tree on stage, and it's there, and it's this cardboard cutout of some sort. That's not actually a tree, but it's a representation of a tree, and we understand it to be a tree. And so then what they end up seeing in these shadows is like the representation, it's the shadow of the representation of a tree, which is the representation of a tree, which is, and so on. And you end up in this like turtles all the way down, whatever. But eventually what the person realizes is I've become so fixated on the shadows, and I've been paying so much attention to the shadows that I've missed things that were more real. And to me, that's just a perfect sort of description of the benefit of awakening or even engaging in a contemplative practice is, what are these shadows that I'm entangled with? What are these shadows that I'm fixated on? Because you can't see clearly, right? Like you're not going to see clearly as long as you're paying attention to the shadows.
Yeah, I like there's some quoter saying, once you teach a child the word for bird, they'll never see a bird again. Because they're just, once you have the language to it, to your point, right? So the other example, and this is, they've actually done, I'm blanking on the study, but there was a well-replicated study where, if you show people a word, like the word blue, and it's in blue, and you say, like, tell me what color the word is, and it's blue, and the word is also blue, they respond much quicker than if it is actually yellow, and the correct answer is yellow because the word is the color yellow, but they read yellow. So like your ability to process information from a language perspective, influence it is a filter for how you experience reality ultimately. And so once you have the language filter, and it's a very quick, fast neurological process, but it's not as fast as actually just seeing the color. So if this experiment is repeated and the words are in a language you don't understand, you just look at the color and say the color. But once you've been taught language, you really shut down a part. Like now you have an interpreter experience, and I'm probably going to butcher some of this, but like according to this guy who's a neuropsychologist, there is a lot of evidence from this from a split brain experiment perspective. It's like our left hemisphere is interpreting the world. And so often it's interpreting the world through the construct of language. And that's why I think hey, the better your vocabulary, the better you may be able to experience certain elements of reality, but you're still interpreting it. And so then that interpreter part of you is also the part that's making comparisons constantly. And so some of this from a neurological perspective that we're talking about is just quieting down the interpretation and just letting reality be. And I'm actually really digging the book. It's kind of like it's I feel like it's it's geared towards someone who probably doesn't have a ton of waking up kind of experience or depth of contemplative practice and is approaching it more from a Western perspective. But it's given me a lot of these like little examples that I'm like, oh, that's good. That's something I'm going to be able to explain to someone else now.
Yeah, man, I love that. That was a great quote. The
bird.
Yeah, but the tamping down the interpretation, right? Like we need language, because for a million different reasons that we can articulate, but ultimately it's about tamping down the language, and that's where I wonder if like where good therapy potentially happens is when we start finding these sort of maladaptive constructs in the process of therapy. Can we swap them out with better ones and caveat that with something like, let's tamp down our relationship to these constructs, right? Like this is just a more useful construct, but it may not be. Like you can tamp down your relationship to it. It doesn't define you. It's not an identity. It's language that you have to access to sort of navigate, but attach not to it. And so if I think about it like through the lens of like attachment therapy, let's just say that like you had the most horrific, unstable sort of childhood and relationship to your parents, and you're just sort of arguably replicating or engaging in behavior in some sort of capacity that resembles your dad or your mom or your relationship to them, then maybe there is some value in being able to say like, wait a second, I'm acting with my dad's voice, I'm acting upon my mom's voice. And maybe that's just sufficient, right? Like we can just leave it at that. It doesn't have to be anything. But I think maybe really good therapy, what it does is it points out that we're potentially operating off some sort of construct, but we don't have to know the source of that construct, where it comes from. I don't know if it matters if dad, your mom, the genetics, whatever it is. It's just a construct, and so you can just go after the construct. But the idea is like once we identify the construct, not to necessarily attach to it, but just to tamp down the strength of it. And so I think like what you were describing earlier with some of this internal family systems, is that becomes a pretty actionable piece of insight or a way of doing that, right? Like I can say, oh, this pattern that I have of like imposter syndrome or whatever the fuck you want to call it. Like if something pops up, you can just identify it as call up my dad's voice and then move on, right? It doesn't require much more processing or anything. And it may not actually be your dad's voice, because what could that even be? But doesn't matter.
Yeah, let's not get into the repressed dreams and shit like that.
God, or Jesus Christ,
repressed memories.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's, again, this is one of the pitfalls is if you get some of that wrong, you've installed a construct that's not actually helping you navigate the world. But if you get it right, it is useful. And so what we need is like good therapy is going to give you useful constructs to navigate the world. And the danger is that if you get the wrong constructs, you may actually you may keep trying to solve the wrong problem. At least that's the way I see it. But maybe I need to engage in more therapy. I certainly have not explored that much.
Jesus Christ, you'd be terrible.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine? What would that be like?
Fucking awful. Just,
Because I would start by like, look, before we dive in today, can you please explain to me your theory of mind? Like,
yeah, exactly.
And okay, is that so? You do think you're the thinker of your thoughts?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how that's going to work for us.
Right. Every therapy session is completely contingent on this moving algorithm of how much coffee and how caffeinated you are in that given moment.
Yeah, I'm about to get into, I think this is a good place to kind of wrap up, but I'm about to get into tea drinking. I'm actually hoping to go to like I don't know what they call it. It's not a tea party, but there's like a pop-up tea thing in Chapel Hill today and tomorrow because I'm trying to reduce my caffeine consumption because it does affect my heart rate and it does affect my blood pressure, and those are things that biologically cause me to experience the world in a certain way that's not always helpful. But damn, I fucking love it, and I love cortisol, and I love just getting shit done.
Yeah. Yeah, when you hit that like sweet zone of caffeinated, it is beautiful. You got to be careful with tea, though. I ran out of coffee somehow this morning, and so I had to resort to some hyper caffeinated tea. And
yeah, I'm talking about oolong tea, Marcus. I'm not talking about just mainlining black tea and telling myself it's better than coffee. That's your Eastern North Carolina, man.
Yeah,
Come on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think maybe I'm eclipsing that,
Yeah. Yeah, I said tea. It made it sound like I made a nice spot of Earl Grey, but instead I just swung through Bojangles.
Oh, Jesus.
No, I didn't actually do that. I didn't do that.
I don't know. All right. Well, so how do you want to land the plane here? You got like 1 minute.
How would I land the plane? I would land the plane by saying that I think therapy is valuable and can be useful as an entry point into a contemplative life. But it's not without its own risks, as you can attach to your own constructs and ideas that arise in therapy, and you can get really stuck and entangled with that. And I think that has some real risk and puts a real ceiling on your ability to sort of thrive. But it may be sufficient for some people.
And I'll land the plane by saying I think the same is true for contemplative practice. And if you really embark on this waking up journey, there's very likely going to there could become a time where you become very nihilistic especially if you're exploring kind of the emptiness thread. And if you don't have proper grounding in that, then you can really wreck your life too. So however you're trying to improve your life, just know that there are risks associated with it, even if it's something as benign as therapy or meditation.
Yeah.
That was kind of good.
That was good. I like that. That's going to go on that real. Yeah.
Until next time.
Till next time.
Thanks for listening to Trip Talks. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend, leave a review in your favorite podcast app, and subscribe to What a Trip on Substack. You can find it at tripjohnson.substack.com. That's TRIPPJOHNSON.substack.com. Thanks a lot.